Between 1973 and 1983, somewhere between 75 and 200 people died at the hands of Roy DeMeo and his crew of contract killers operating out of a Flatlands, Brooklyn auto repair shop called the Gemini Lounge. The confirmed victims numbered at least 75, though investigators believed the real count exceeded 100 and possibly reached 200, making the DeMeo crew one of the most prolific murder operations in American organized crime history. The method wasn't sophisticated or elegant. It was industrial, systematic, efficient. Victims were lured to the Gemini Lounge under various pretenses, shot in the head immediately upon entering, then dragged to a back apartment where the crew had perfected a disassembly process they called the Gemini Method, a systematic dismemberment technique that could reduce a human body to manageable pieces in under an hour, pieces that would be wrapped in plastic, loaded into cardboard boxes, and scattered across Brooklyn's numerous garbage dumps and landfills where they'd never be found, or, if found, would never be identified. The perpetrator wasn't a lone serial killer operating in shadows, but a crew of 5 to 10 men working for the Gambino crime family led by Roy DeMeo, a 42-year-old car salesman and loan shark who'd discovered that murder could be profitable when combined with efficiency, and who'd assembled a team of killers so productive that even other Mafia figures were disturbed by their body count and their methods. If you have the courage to hear this story, click here to find out what happened, but I warn you, the details are graphic. This narrative contains extreme violence based on real events that exposed how murder became an assembly line operation in 1970s Brooklyn, how organized crime industrialized killing to the point where human beings were processed like products on a factory floor, and how a group of working-class men from Brooklyn transformed a car repair shop into a slaughterhouse that operated for a decade while law enforcement struggled to understand the scope of what was happening or to connect the scattered body parts found across New York to a single source. And it reveals the terrifying reality that the most prolific killers aren't always the ones who fit our stereotypes of psychopaths or serial murderers. Sometimes they're ordinary men with families and mortgages who view murder as a job, as work that pays well, as something you do between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. before going home for dinner with the wife and kids. On January 10, 1983, two men walking their dogs in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn, noticed what they initially thought was a mannequin partially visible in a frozen creek bed. Upon closer inspection, they realized it was a human torso, no head, no arms, no legs, just a male torso wrapped in plastic garbage bags that had been dumped and had partially emerged from the ice as temperatures fluctuated. The men called police, who arrived to find exactly what the witnesses had described: the dismembered torso of an adult male, cleanly cut at neck, shoulders, and hips, wrapped in standard black plastic garbage bags, showing signs of having been frozen before being dumped. This discovery wasn't unusual for Brooklyn in 1983. The New York Police Department had been finding dismembered bodies and body parts across Brooklyn for years, in dumpsters, in abandoned buildings, floating in rivers and bays, buried in shallow graves in vacant lots. The pattern was clear. Someone was killing people and dismembering them with skill that suggested either medical training or extensive practice. But connecting the scattered remains to a single source was nearly impossible because the dismemberment destroyed forensic evidence, because bodies dumped in different locations fell under different precinct jurisdictions, and because the victims were often criminals or people on society's margins whose disappearances weren't immediately reported. What police didn't know in January 1983 was that the torso in Sheepshead Bay would be one of the last victims of an operation that had been killing people systematically for nearly a decade. They didn't know that within weeks the entire structure would collapse, that one of the most prolific murder crews in American history would be exposed, and that investigators would confront the disturbing reality that a single group operating out of a Brooklyn bar and auto shop had been responsible for at least 75 murders and possibly more than 100, had been operating essentially unchecked since the mid-1970s, and had perfected murder and dismemberment to the point where it had become a routine business operation rather than a criminal activity that required planning or produced anxiety. The NYPD detective who caught the Sheepshead Bay torso case was Detective Sergeant William Delmore, a 20-year veteran of the Brooklyn Homicide Squad who'd worked dozens of dismemberment cases over his career and who'd begun to suspect that many of them were connected. Delmore had been maintaining an unofficial database, keeping notes on every dismembered body found in Brooklyn, looking for patterns in the cutting techniques, in the types of plastic used for wrapping, in the locations where remains were dumped. He'd identified similarities that suggested a single source or a single method being used by multiple actors, but he'd had no way to prove connections because so many victims couldn't be identified, because forensic technology in the early 1980s couldn't link dismembered parts found months or years apart, and because the jurisdictional fragmentation of NYPD meant that different precincts handled different cases without necessarily sharing information that might reveal broader patterns. But by January 1983, Delmore had another source of information, a federal investigation into the Gambino crime family that had stumbled upon evidence of a systematic murder operation centered in Flatlands, Brooklyn. The FBI, working with NYPD's organized crime task force, had been surveilling a crew led by Roy DeMeo, initially investigating him for car theft and interstate transportation of stolen vehicles. But their surveillance had picked up conversations suggesting that DeMeo's crew was involved in something far more serious than car theft. Conversations about pieces, about packages, about cleaning up messes, all in contexts that suggested they were discussing murders and body disposal rather than automotive activities. The convergence of Delmore's dismemberment investigations and the federal surveillance of DeMeo's crew would eventually expose one of the most disturbing criminal operations in New York history, a murder factory that had operated for nearly a decade, that had killed at least 75 people and possibly twice that many, and that had functioned so efficiently that most of the murders had gone undetected, had been classified as missing persons cases rather than homicides, had simply disappeared into the statistical noise of a city where hundreds of people went missing every year and where most were never found. The social stakes of the DeMeo crew's decade-long murder operation extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The crew operated in Flatlands and Canarsie, working-class Brooklyn neighborhoods where Italian-American families had lived for generations, where everyone knew everyone, where community bonds were supposed to provide safety, and where organized crime, while present, was supposed to operate according to codes that protected civilians and that kept violence contained within criminal circles where it didn't threaten ordinary people. The DeMeo crew shattered those assumptions completely. They didn't just kill other criminals, they killed anyone who became inconvenient, anyone who knew too much, anyone who owed money and couldn't pay, anyone who'd witnessed something they shouldn't have, and occasionally people who were simply in the wrong place when the crew needed to demonstrate their willingness to use violence. The victims included mob associates who'd become liabilities, but also used car salesmen who'd gotten into disputes with DeMeo, drug dealers who'd refused to pay tribute, small-time criminals who'd stolen from the wrong people, and in at least one case, an innocent college student who'd had the misfortune of accidentally witnessing a murder and who was killed to eliminate him as a potential witness. The impact on community trust was profound once the scope of the crew's activities became public. People who'd lived in flatlands for decades, who'd known Roy DeMeo as a neighbor and a local businessman, who'd maybe bought used cars from his dealership or seen his children in the neighborhood, had to reconcile that familiarity with the reality that DeMeo had been operating a murder factory blocks from their homes, had been killing people and dismembering bodies while maintaining a facade of suburban normalcy. The Gemini Lounge, where much of the killing occurred, was a neighborhood bar, a place where local guys would drink and socialize, a familiar landmark. Learning that the back apartment had been converted into a slaughterhouse where dozens of people had been murdered and dismembered was like learning that hell existed in your own backyard and you'd somehow never noticed. The financial stakes extended throughout Brooklyn's legitimate and illegitimate economies. DeMeo's crew didn't just kill for the Gambino family. They operated as independent contractors, accepting murder contracts from various criminal organizations, creating a murder-for-hire service that charged between $5,000 and $50,000 per hit, depending on the difficulty and risk involved. This turned murder into a commodity, into a service that could be purchased by anyone with enough money and criminal connections, and it meant that anyone involved in Brooklyn's underworld economy, bookies, loan sharks, drug dealers, legitimate businessmen who had gotten involved with the wrong people, lived with the knowledge that crossing the wrong person might result in being killed by the DeMeo crew and reduced to pieces scattered across Brooklyn's garbage dumps. The emotional well-being of survivors, families of the approximately 200 victims, was catastrophically damaged by the nature of DeMeo's operation. In traditional murders, even Mafia murders, families could usually recover bodies, could have funerals, could achieve some sense of closure. The DeMeo crew's systematic dismemberment and disposal meant that most victims' remains were never found, or, if found, couldn't be identified because the dismemberment had removed identifying features like faces and fingerprints, because bodies were so thoroughly destroyed that DNA technology of the 1970s and early 80s couldn't establish identity, and because the crew had been careful to remove anything, clothing, jewelry, identification, that could be used to determine who the victim had been. Families were left with missing persons, cases that went unresolved for years or decades. They never knew with certainty whether their loved one was dead or had simply disappeared, whether to maintain hope or to begin grieving, whether to move on with their lives or to continue searching. This ambiguous loss, the psychological term for losing someone without confirmation of death, created trauma that was often worse than the trauma of confirmed death because it prevented closure, prevented the grieving process from completing, left families suspended in a state of painful uncertainty that could last for the rest of their lives. The safety implications were immediate and severe for anyone operating in Brooklyn's criminal economy or even on its margins. The DeMeo crew's willingness to kill for relatively minor reasons, disputes over money, perceived disrespect, simple convenience when someone became a potential liability, meant that being involved in any criminal activity, even peripherally, carried risks that had previously been less severe. Before DeMeo, Brooklyn's mob violence had been relatively contained and targeted. Made men killed other made men, usually for serious violations of Mafia codes. DeMeo's crew killed anyone for any reason without the traditional restraints that had made organized crime violence somewhat predictable and avoidable if you weren't directly involved in mob activities. Brooklyn in the 1970s and early 80s was a borough in transition and decline. The neighborhoods where the DeMeo crew operated, Flatlands, Canarsie, East New York, Brownsville, were working-class areas that had been predominantly white ethnic, Italian, Irish, Jewish, but were experiencing demographic change as white families moved to the suburbs and were replaced by black and Hispanic families. The resulting racial tensions, combined with economic decline as manufacturing jobs disappeared and urban decay accelerated, created an atmosphere of instability and anxiety that affected both legitimate residents and the criminal underworld. Flatlands, specifically where Roy DeMeo lived and where the Gemini Lounge was located, was a neighborhood of small single-family homes and low-rise apartment buildings, tree-lined streets, corner stores, and neighborhood bars. It looked like safe, working-class America. People went to work, kids played in streets, families attended church on Sundays. But beneath that surface normalcy was a criminal economy that had existed in Brooklyn for generations. Bookmaking, loan sharking, truck hijacking, stolen goods, labor racketeering, all controlled by organized crime families that had run these operations since the early 20th century. The physical geography of Brooklyn made it ideal for the kind of operation DeMeo ran. The borough was vast, 71 square miles with population over 2 million, large enough that bodies could be dumped in hundreds of different locations without creating obvious patterns. Brooklyn had numerous industrial areas with abandoned buildings, vacant lots, and commercial dumpsters that were rarely monitored. The borough's coastline provided access to water, Jamaica Bay, Sheepshead Bay, the various creeks and channels where bodies could be dumped and might never be found, or if found, would be so decomposed from water exposure that identification was impossible. The Jamaica Bay Wildlife Refuge, ironically a protected area managed by the National Park Service, became one of DeMeo's preferred dumping grounds. The refuge covered over 9,000 acres of marshland, much of it inaccessible except by boat, with areas that were rarely visited by park rangers or the public. Bodies dumped in the refuge's remote sections might be found eventually, or they might decompose completely in the marsh environment, consumed by wildlife and bacteria, disappearing without trace. The 1970s and early 80s were also a period when law enforcement resources were stretched thin. New York City was experiencing fiscal crisis, was cutting budgets, was laying off police officers. The NYPD in the late 1970s had fewer officers than it had had in the 1960s despite population growth and increasing crime rates. Homicide detectives were overloaded with cases, couldn't give adequate attention to every murder, had to triage and focus on cases where they had clear leads or significant public pressure to solve. Dismembered bodies found in dumpsters or vacant lots, particularly when victims couldn't be identified, often received minimal investigation because detectives simply didn't have time or resources to pursue cases with such poor prospects for solution. This combination, vast geography with numerous disposal sites, strained law enforcement resources, and a criminal economy that already involved significant violence, created ideal conditions for a murder operation like DeMeo's to flourish essentially unchecked for nearly a decade. Roy Albert DeMeo was born on September 7, 1940, in Bath Beach, Brooklyn, to working-class Italian-American parents who'd immigrated from Italy in the early 20th century. His father was a day laborer, his mother a homemaker, and Roy grew up in the kind of Brooklyn neighborhood where organized crime was a visible and accepted part of community life, where everyone knew which local businesses were mob-connected, where Mafia figures were respected as successful men who'd made it in a system that didn't offer many opportunities to working-class Italians, where joining the mob was seen as a legitimate career path for young men who were smart and ambitious, but who lacked education or connections that would allow success in the legitimate economy. Roy wasn't particularly large. He stood about 5'10" and weighed around 200 pounds by his 30s, but he was powerfully built, with thick arms and shoulders that came from years of physical labor before he found more profitable criminal work. His most distinctive feature was his eyes, dark, intense, emotionless when he wanted them to be, capable of the flat, predatory stare that marked serious criminals who'd learned to view other humans as objects rather than people. What Roy valued most was money and the status that money provided. Not money as abstract wealth, but money as tangible proof of success, as the ability to buy nice cars and expensive clothes and a house in a good neighborhood, as the capacity to provide for his family in ways his father never had, as the visible evidence that he'd made it, that he wasn't just another working-class Italian struggling to get by, but was someone important, someone successful, someone who commanded respect. Roy's criminal career began in the early 1960s with small-time operations, bookmaking, loan sharking, the traditional entry-level mob activities that allowed young men to prove themselves. But Roy distinguished himself through his ambition and his complete lack of conscience when it came to violence. He was willing to kill when necessary, showed no hesitation or emotional reaction when ordered to eliminate people, and demonstrated the kind of cold efficiency that made him valuable to organized crime families who always needed reliable people for violent work. By the late 1960s, Roy had come to the attention of the Gambino crime family, specifically Anthony Gaggi, a capo, captain, in the family who supervised criminal operations in Brooklyn and who was looking for capable people to expand his crew's activities. Gaggi recognized Roy's potential, his intelligence, his ambition, his complete lack of moral boundaries when it came to crime and violence, and took him under his wing, mentoring him in Mafia operations and introducing him to the family's leadership. Through the early 1970s, Roy developed a lucrative operation dealing in stolen cars. He'd buy stolen luxury vehicles, would forge VIN numbers and title documents, would sell them to unsuspecting buyers, or ship them overseas, where the documentation couldn't be easily verified. The car theft operation generated significant income, hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, and established Roy as a successful earner for the Gambino family, someone who generated money that could be kicked up to family leadership and who therefore deserved protection and support for his activities. But the car theft operation had a problem. It generated disputes. Buyers would discover they'd purchased stolen vehicles and would threaten to go to police. Suppliers would steal cars and then demand more money than agreed upon. Competitors would try to move into Roy's territory. In the early days, Roy would handle these disputes through negotiation or intimidation, but he discovered that killing people who became problems was often more efficient than trying to manage them through other means. Someone threatens to go to police, kill them. Someone demands more money, kill them. Competitor won't back off, kill them. These initial killings, probably beginning around 1972, 1973, were handled amateurishly. Bodies were dumped intact. Victims were shot in locations where witnesses might exist. The murders created forensic evidence that could potentially connect to Roy if investigated thoroughly. But Roy was a practical man who learned from experience and who approached problems methodically. If murder was going to be part of his business model, and by 1973 it was clear that it would be, then he needed to systematize it, needed to make it safer and more efficient. needed to develop methods that would prevent the kinds of forensic evidence and witness testimony that could result in arrests and prosecutions. This practical approach to murder, treating it as a business problem requiring systematic solutions rather than as a moral boundary that shouldn't be crossed, led Roy to develop what would become known as the Gemini Method, and to assemble a crew of killers who would help him implement that method at a scale unprecedented in American organized crime. Roy DeMeo assembled his crew carefully over several years, recruiting young men from Brooklyn's working-class Italian and Irish neighborhoods who met specific criteria. They needed to be willing to kill without hesitation, needed to be loyal to Roy above all else, needed to be intelligent enough to follow complex procedures, and crucially, needed to be capable of viewing murder as work rather than as something that produced guilt or psychological trauma. The core members of the DeMeo crew, the men who would participate directly in the majority of the 75-plus murders, were Anthony Center and Joseph Testa, cousins who'd grown up together in Canarsie, both in their early 20s when recruited by Roy in the mid-1970s. Center and Testa were known as the Gemini twins because they were inseparable and because they'd both demonstrated a disturbing enthusiasm for violence. They didn't just kill because Roy ordered them to, they seemed to enjoy it, seemed to take satisfaction from the power and the brutality. Psychological evaluations conducted years later, after their arrests, suggested both had antisocial personality disorder, the clinical term for what was once called psychopathy. They felt no empathy, experienced no guilt, viewed other humans as objects that existed to be used or destroyed based on convenience. Chris Rosenberg, born Christian Nicholas Rosenberg to a Jewish mother and Italian father in his mid-20s when he joined the crew, was Roy's protege and likely successor. Chris was charming, intelligent, handsome, able to talk his way into and out of situations, able to gain people's trust before betraying them. He was particularly useful for luring victims. He'd befriend people, would gain their confidence, would convince them to come to the Gemini Lounge for various reasons where they'd be killed immediately upon entering. Chris's ability to compartmentalize was extraordinary. He could befriend someone, could spend time with them building relationship and trust, then could lead them to their deaths without apparent emotional conflict. Henry Borelli, in his late 20s, was less intelligent than the others, but was reliable and was willing to do the gruesome work that even some killers found difficult: the dismemberment, the cleanup, the disposal of remains. Henry wasn't a planner or a leader, but he was essential to the crew's operations because he could spend hours dismembering bodies without becoming nauseated or traumatized, could handle the physical and psychological demands of the work without breaking down. Frederick Denome, who went by Freddie, was in his early 30s, had some medical training from his time in the Army, and was the one who'd taught the crew proper dismemberment techniques: where to cut to separate joints efficiently, how to remove heads and hands, which contained identifying features like faces and fingerprints, how to drain blood to reduce mess, how to wrap pieces for disposal. Freddie approached dismemberment with professional detachment, would instruct the others on technique like he was teaching a butchery class, treated human bodies as material to be processed rather than as people who'd recently been alive. Joey Testa, distinct from Joseph Testa mentioned above, the crew had multiple members named Joey, which investigators found confusing. Richie Denome, Freddie's younger brother, and several others who participated in murders but weren't part of the core group that handled every killing. The crew's size fluctuated between about 5 and 10 active members, depending on how much work they had at any given time, and on whether Roy felt comfortable enough with someone's loyalty and competence to include them in the most serious operations. What unified these men wasn't background or personality type. They ranged from the genuinely psychopathic, Center and Testa, to the merely amoral, Borelli, who didn't seem to enjoy killing but didn't object to it either, from the intelligent and manipulative Chris Rosenberg to the simply reliable Henry Borelli, who followed orders without question. What they shared was the ability to kill repeatedly without guilt, to treat murder as routine work, and to maintain loyalty to Roy and to each other, even when that loyalty required committing acts that would horrify normal people. Roy fostered this loyalty through several mechanisms. First, he paid well. Crew members earned far more than they could have earned in legitimate work, enough to support comfortable lifestyles, to buy houses and cars, to provide for families. Second, he created a sense of exclusivity and brotherhood. Being part of the DeMeo crew meant being part of something special, being part of an elite group that was respected and feared throughout Brooklyn's underworld. Third, he ensured mutual complicity. Everyone who participated in murders was equally guilty, meaning nobody could cooperate with authorities without implicating themselves in multiple homicides, creating a structure where loyalty was enforced by shared criminal liability. The crew spent significant time together socially, not just during criminal operations. They'd hang out at the Gemini Lounge during downtime, would drink together, would attend each other's family events, would go on vacations together. This social cohesion made the crew function more effectively when they needed to commit murders. They'd worked together enough, knew each other well enough, that they could coordinate complex operations with minimal verbal communication, could anticipate each other's actions, could function as a unit rather than as individuals. What distinguished the DeMeo crew from other mob killers was their systematic approach to murder and disposal, a method they refined over time until it became an efficient assembly line process that could be executed quickly with minimal risk and minimal forensic evidence. This method, which came to be called the Gemini Method after the lounge where it was most often employed, had several stages. Stage 1, the lure. Potential victims needed to be brought to a location where they could be killed without witnesses and where the crew had the equipment and space necessary for dismemberment and disposal. The Gemini Lounge was ideal for this. It was Roy's territory, a neighborhood bar that was familiar to people in Brooklyn's underworld, and it had a back apartment that had been converted into a killing room. The crew used various methods to lure victims to the Gemini. Sometimes they'd invite people for meetings about business opportunities, car deals, drug transactions, other criminal enterprises that sounded profitable, and that gave victims reason to show up voluntarily. Chris Rosenberg was particularly skilled at this, would spend weeks befriending targets, building trust, making them comfortable until the moment when he'd suggest meeting at the Gemini to finalize some deal. And the target would agree because they'd been conditioned to trust Chris and to view the Gemini as a normal, safe location. Sometimes they'd use women, either crew members' girlfriends or prostitutes who'd been hired to lure victims. The attractive woman would approach a target at a bar or nightclub, would flirt, would suggest going somewhere more private, and would lead them to the Gemini where crew members would be waiting. The victims, thinking they were about to have a sexual encounter, would enter willingly and would be killed before they understood the situation. Sometimes they'd simply grab people, would kidnap them off streets or from their homes or cars, would use force to bring them to the Gemini when deception wasn't possible or practical. But these snatch and grab operations were riskier because they created witnesses and because struggling victims might leave forensic evidence in the vehicles used for transport. Stage 2, the kill, the ideal Gemini method. Murder happened immediately upon the victim entering the location, before they had time to understand what was happening, before they could react or resist, or create a scene that might attract attention. The most common method was a single shot to the head from behind. The victim would enter the Gemini Lounge. The door would close behind them, and within seconds someone would shoot them in the back of the head with a pistol, usually a .22 or .25 caliber, equipped with a suppressor, a homemade device, since legal suppressors were difficult to obtain. The small caliber was deliberate. .22 and .25 caliber bullets would penetrate the skull but wouldn't exit the other side, meaning blood spatter would be minimal and wouldn't spray across the room, creating evidence. The suppressor made the shots quiet enough that they wouldn't be heard on the street or in neighboring buildings, sounding like dull pops that witnesses might mistake for car backfires or construction noise. The victim would drop immediately if shot correctly. If the bullet penetrated the brainstem, death was instant, and the body would collapse without struggle, without screaming, without the violent movements that would make dismemberment more difficult and messy. If the first shot didn't immediately kill, the shooter would fire additional shots until the victim was dead. Speed was essential. From the moment the victim entered until they were dead on the floor should take less than 15 seconds, quick enough that they had no opportunity to fight back or call for help. Sometimes, if suppressors weren't available or if the situation made shooting impractical, they'd use other methods. Stabbing was common. Multiple crew members would simultaneously stab the victim with knives, would hit major blood vessels and organs, would kill through catastrophic blood loss in under a minute. Strangulation was occasionally used, though it was less preferred because it took longer and because struggling victims were harder to control. In at least one case, they used a steel pipe to beat someone to death, though this was rare because it was messy and because the violence attracted more attention than a quick shooting. Stage 3. The drain. Once the victim was dead, they'd be dragged to the back apartment to a bathroom that had been modified for the crew's purposes. The bathtub had been reinforced, the drain had been enlarged, and plastic sheeting covered the walls and floor to protect against blood spatter. The body would be placed in the tub, positioned so that blood would drain efficiently. Roy DeMeo, with his medical training, had taught the crew that draining blood before dismemberment made the process cleaner and easier. Bodies drained of blood were lighter, were less messy to cut, and didn't leave blood trails when pieces were moved. The drain process was simple. Cut the throat deeply, cutting the carotid arteries and jugular veins, then make additional cuts to major blood vessels in the arms and legs if necessary. Gravity would pull most of the blood out through these cuts, down the drain, where it would flow into Brooklyn's sewer system and disappear. The draining took 15 to 30 minutes, depending on the body size and how thoroughly they wanted to drain it. During this time, other crew members would prepare tools for the next stage, would lay out saws and knives, would prepare cardboard boxes for the pieces, would ready plastic bags and tape for wrapping. The crew treated this like any other work procedure, would sometimes listen to radio during the drain, would chat about sports or women or whatever topic, would demonstrate the complete emotional detachment that allowed them to function in an environment that would traumatize normal people. Stage 4. The dismemberment. This was the stage that made the DeMeo crew's method distinctive, and that prevented most of their victims from ever being identified. The dismemberment was systematic, following a specific sequence that Roy DeMeo had developed based on his understanding of human anatomy and on trial and error experience from the crew's early murders. First, remove the head, cut through the neck at the base of the skull, through the vertebrae, separating the head completely from the body. The head would be placed in a separate bag, for separate disposal because it contained the face, the teeth, all the identifying features that could allow victim identification if the head was found and wasn't too decomposed. Second, remove the hands. Cut through the wrists, separating hands from forearms, again for separate disposal because hands contained fingerprints that could be used for identification. The hands would go in the same bag as the head, or sometimes in separate bags if they were disposing in different locations. Third, open the torso. Cut from sternum to pelvis, opening the abdominal cavity, removing organs which would be bagged separately. This step served multiple purposes. It reduced the body's volume, made the torso lighter and easier to handle, and ensured that if the torso was dumped in water, it would sink rather than float. Bodies float because of gases produced by decomposition in the organs. Removing organs eliminates that buoyancy. Fourth, separate the limbs, cut through shoulders and hips, separating arms and legs from the torso. The crew used both knives and saws, depending on what they were cutting, knives for soft tissue and saws for bones. They'd learned through experience which tools worked best for different parts of anatomy, had refined their techniques to the point where a full dismemberment could be completed in 30-45 minutes by experienced crew members working together. Finally, wrap and box the pieces. Each piece would be wrapped in plastic bags, often multiple layers to prevent leakage, then placed in cardboard boxes. Standard boxes from supermarkets or liquor stores worked well. They were inconspicuous, could be disposed of easily, and would disintegrate if exposed to water or weather, making the remains even harder to discover and identify. The entire process from death to boxed pieces took 1 to 2 hours, depending on the body's size and how much care the crew took. They'd done it so many times that it became routine, mechanical, no different psychologically from any other repetitive manual labor. Crew members would joke while working, would compete to see who could dismember fastest, would critique each other's technique like craftsmen discussing their trade. The complete absence of empathy or horror about what they were doing was perhaps more disturbing than the violence itself. These were men who could spend an afternoon dismembering human bodies and then go home for dinner with their families without experiencing any emotional conflict about what they'd done. Stage 5, the disposal. The final stage was distributing the pieces across multiple locations to ensure that even if some parts were found, they couldn't be connected to each other or identified as belonging to specific victims. The crew had numerous disposal sites they rotated through, commercial dumpsters across Brooklyn, particularly in industrial areas where dumpsters were emptied frequently and where garbage went directly to landfills without being sorted, Jamaica Bay Wildlife Refuge, where pieces could be weighted and thrown into deep water or left in remote marsh areas where they decompose naturally, various construction sites where debris was being dumped, where body parts would be buried under tons of construction waste, incinerators at mob-connected businesses where boxes could be burned, reducing bodies to ash, distant locations in other states when they had time and reason to travel. Pieces would sometimes be dumped hundreds of miles away when crew members were making trips for other criminal purposes. The key was distribution. No two pieces from the same body would be disposed in the same location, making it nearly impossible for police to reconstruct a complete victim, even if multiple parts were found. The head and hands always went to different locations from the torso and limbs, ensuring that even if larger pieces were found, they couldn't be identified without the face and fingerprints. This systematic approach to disposal meant that most of the DeMeo crew's victims were never found at all, simply disappeared, were classified as missing persons, and remained mysteries to their families and to law enforcement. Of the estimated 7,200 victims, fewer than 30 were found and identified, and even for those found, Connecting them to the DeMeo crew took years of investigation and required testimony from crew members who eventually cooperated with authorities. What made the DeMeo crew unusual wasn't just their body count or their methods, but how they'd normalized murder, how they'd transformed it from an extraordinary act, requiring psychological preparation, into routine work that required no more emotional investment than changing a tire or filing paperwork. Understanding how this normalization occurred requires examining both the practical and psychological mechanisms that made it possible. The business model. Roy DeMeo operated murder as a business with pricing, contracts, procedures, and quality control. He'd accept murder contracts from various criminal organizations, primarily from the Gambino family hierarchy, who'd order him to eliminate people who'd become problems, but also from other crime families, from independent criminals, and occasionally from people outside organized crime who'd somehow made contact and who had enough money to purchase his services. Pricing varied based on several factors. Target's status. Killing a civilian was cheaper, $5,000, $10,000, than killing someone connected to organized crime, $15,000, $30,000, because mob-connected targets were more likely to be suspicious, were more likely to be armed, and killing them created risks of retaliation. Complexity. Simple murders where the target could be lured to the Gemini were cheaper than elaborate operations requiring extensive planning or travel urgency. Rush jobs commanded premium pricing. Special requirements. If the client wanted the death to look like an accident or wanted the body found to send a message rather than disappeared, Roy charged extra. The crew would sometimes kill on speculation, would eliminate people who they believed were becoming problems even without specific contracts, gambling that the elimination would be appreciated by mob leadership and would generate goodwill and future business. This speculative killing was particularly common when the crew encountered people who'd witnessed their activities or who knew too much about their operations. The schedule. The crew operated on a schedule much like legitimate business. They'd typically be at the Gemini Lounge during daytime hours, would conduct murders in the afternoon when the bar was closed to the public, but when the crew was present for business meetings. Evenings, the Gemini would open to public, would function as a normal bar, though most customers were either mob-connected or were unaware of what happened in the back apartment during closed hours. Murders were rarely spontaneous. They were planned in advance when possible, were scheduled like appointments. Roy would know days or sometimes weeks in advance that someone needed to be eliminated, would assign crew members to surveillance and planning, would determine the best method to lure the target to the kill site, and would schedule the murder for a specific day and time when all necessary crew members would be available. This scheduling allowed crew members to maintain the appearance of normal lives. They had families, had homes, had regular patterns of behavior that looked ordinary to neighbors and to law enforcement. They'd show up for murder work, like showing up for shifts at a factory, would do their jobs efficiently, would clean up afterward, and would go home to their wives and children, would eat dinner and watch television, and help kids with homework before going to bed. The compartmentalization was complete. Work was work, home was home, and there was no psychological bleed between the two domains. The training. New crew members underwent informal training in the Gemini Method, learning procedures from experienced members through hands-on experience. The first time a new member participated in a murder, they typically have a support role, might help restrain a victim or assist with cleanup, while observing how experienced members handled the actual killing and dismemberment. Subsequent murders would involve more direct participation until the new member was competent at all aspects of the operation. This training process served multiple purposes. Practically, It ensured that all crew members could perform all necessary functions, creating redundancy so that operations could continue even if some members were unavailable. Psychologically, it desensitized new members gradually, exposed them to increasing levels of violence and gore at a pace that allowed them to adapt without being overwhelmed, and ensured that they were fully complicit in multiple murders before they'd been in the crew long enough to pose security risks. The justifications. Crew members developed various psychological justifications for their work, rationalizations that allowed them to maintain self-images as something other than mass murderers, even though that's objectively what they were. Common justifications included, they were criminals anyway. Most victims were involved in criminal activities, which allowed crew members to rationalize that they weren't killing innocent people, that their victims had chosen a dangerous life and had accepted the risks, just following orders. Crew members could tell themselves they were just doing their jobs, following orders from Roy or from Gambino family hierarchy, and that they weren't personally responsible for decisions about who lived or died. It's business. Treating murder as business, as transactions that had nothing to do with personal feelings or morality, allowed psychological distance from the human consequences of their actions better them than us. In the mob world, not being willing to kill meant being vulnerable to being killed, so crew members could rationalize their violence as self-defense, as necessary for survival in the environment they inhabited. These justifications weren't necessarily consciously articulated. Crew members probably didn't sit around discussing their moral reasoning. But psychological research on how ordinary people commit atrocities suggests that these kinds of rationalizations operate at subconscious levels, allowing people to do terrible things while maintaining psychological equilibrium and while avoiding the guilt and trauma that would otherwise result from repeatedly killing people. Reconstructing the lives of the DeMeo crew's victims is difficult because many were never identified, because many of the identified victims were criminals whose lives weren't extensively documented, and because the crew's systematic destruction of evidence meant that even basic facts like how many people were killed and who they were remain uncertain decades later. But from investigative reports, testimony from crew members who eventually cooperated, and from the missing persons cases that were eventually connected to the crew, some patterns emerge. Mob-connected victims. Many victims were people connected to organized crime who'd become liabilities. Andrei Katz, a Russian emigre who'd been involved in drug trafficking with the crew, but who'd begun using drugs himself, had become unreliable, had been arrested, and was suspected of considering cooperation with authorities to reduce his charges. Roy determined Katz needed to be eliminated before he could make a deal with prosecutors. Katz was lured to the Gemini under pretense of discussing a drug shipment, was shot immediately upon entering, and was dismembered using the standard Gemini method. His remains were scattered across Brooklyn. His head and hands were never found. Katz's family filed a missing persons report, but were stonewalled by police who suspected Katz had fled to avoid drug charges. It wasn't until years later, after crew members began cooperating, that authorities learned Katz had been murdered and approximately where some of his remains had been dumped. Paul Rothenberg, a car thief who'd worked with Roy's stolen car operation but who'd been skimming money, taking cars for himself rather than turning them over to Roy as agreed. Roy couldn't let this theft go unpunished because allowing someone to steal from him would be seen as weakness by others in the criminal world, potentially encouraging further theft. Rothenberg was invited to meet Roy to discuss a new car deal, arrived at the Gemini, was killed and dismembered. His family was told he'd left town to avoid criminal charges, which was believable enough that they didn't push too hard for investigation. Years later, when FBI agents interviewed Rothenberg's family about their missing son, they learned that the family had assumed for years that Paul was alive somewhere, possibly in prison under an assumed name, possibly living quietly in another state, anything except dead and dismembered by the people he'd considered colleagues and friends. Chris Rosenberg, Roy's protege and one of the core crew members, was eventually killed by the crew in 1979, shot and left in his car in an apparent staged accident, not dismembered because the killing needed to look like something other than a mob hit. Chris had become a liability. He was using cocaine heavily, was attracting attention from law enforcement, was involved in drug dealing that Gambino family leadership hadn't authorized, and was dating the daughter of a high-ranking mobster who wanted Chris away from his daughter. Roy was ordered to kill Chris and complied despite Chris being the closest thing to a son Roy had. Roy's actual biological sons were not involved in his criminal activities. The murder of Chris Rosenberg demonstrates the crew's complete subordination to mob hierarchy. Even one of their own core members, someone who'd participated in dozens of murders, who'd been loyal for years, could be killed without hesitation when mob leadership decided his continued existence was inconvenient. Civilian victims. Some victims weren't criminals, but were civilians who'd become entangled with the crew through bad luck or bad judgment. Dominic Rigucci, a college student who'd witnessed one of the crew's murders, had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, had seen something he shouldn't have seen, and therefore needed to be eliminated as a potential witness, even though he wasn't involved in criminal activity and hadn't done anything to the crew. Rigucci was grabbed off the street near his Brooklyn College campus, was brought to the Gemini, was killed, and dismembered. His disappearance was never solved until years later when crew members described the murder to authorities. Rigucci's parents spent years searching for their son, distributing flyers, hiring private investigators, refusing to believe he was dead because they couldn't accept that their college-attending son, who'd had no connection to organized crime, could simply disappear. Learning eventually that he'd been murdered by the DeMeo crew because he'd accidentally witnessed something didn't provide closure, it only intensified their grief by making clear that their son's death had been senseless, that he'd been killed not because of anything he'd done, but simply because he'd been in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Joseph Miale, a used car salesman who'd gotten into a business dispute with Roy, had refused to pay money that Roy claimed was owed, had perhaps not understood that business disputes with Roy DeMeo couldn't be resolved through normal legal channels or negotiation. Miale was lured to the Gemini under pretense of resolving the dispute, was killed and dismembered. His wife reported him missing, was told by police that he'd probably left town to escape debts, which was true, except that he'd been prevented from leaving town by being murdered. The murder of Joseph Miale was particularly senseless. He'd owed maybe $10,000, an amount that Roy earned in a single murder contract, an amount so trivial that killing someone over it seemed excessive even by mob standards. But Roy's policy was that nobody was allowed to refuse to pay him, that any perceived disrespect or defiance required violent response, regardless of whether the violence made financial sense. Victims who disappeared completely. Dozens of victims were never identified, were people who disappeared without leaving enough evidence for police to even open murder investigations. Missing persons reports were filed by families, but without bodies or evidence of foul play, police couldn't investigate these cases as homicides and couldn't dedicate resources to searching for people who might have simply left town voluntarily. These unidentified victims created a category of loss that was particularly cruel to families, not just the grief of losing someone, but the eternal uncertainty of not knowing what happened, of maintaining hope long past the point when hope was reasonable, of never having closure or confirmation that would allow the grieving process to complete. Even after the DeMeo crew was eventually exposed and crew members began cooperating with authorities, many victims couldn't be identified because crew members didn't know their names, knew them only as, "That guy Roy told us to kill," remembered the murders themselves, but couldn't provide information that would help authorities identify who'd been killed or notify families. The DeMeo crew operated successfully for nearly a decade, from approximately 1973 through 1982, killing 75-200 people with minimal interference from law enforcement. But by 1982, multiple factors were converging that would eventually expose the operation and end Roy DeMeo's career. Law enforcement pressure. Federal and local law enforcement had been aware of Roy DeMeo as a significant mob figure since the late 1970s, though initially they'd focused on his car theft operations rather than on murder. The FBI, working with NYPD's Organized Crime Task Force, had established surveillance on Roy and his crew, had recorded conversations that suggested criminal activity, but hadn't understood the full scope of what the crew was doing. The breakthrough came through cooperation from lower-level criminals who'd interacted with the crew and who'd seen or heard things that made them suspicious about murders. One such informant, a small-time car thief who'd done business with Roy, told FBI agents that Roy had once casually mentioned that killing people who became problems was more efficient than trying to manage them through other means, that Roy had implied he'd killed numerous people over the years. The informant couldn't provide specific details about victims or methods, but his information was sufficient to shift FBI focus from car theft to potential murders. Surveillance intensified through 1981 and 1982. FBI agents monitored the Gemini Lounge, photographed people coming and going, ran license plates of vehicles parked outside, and gradually built a database of who was associating with Roy and his crew. They noticed patterns. Certain people would be photographed arriving at the Gemini and would never be seen leaving, would disappear from surveillance after their Gemini visit, would be reported missing by families days or weeks later. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental, suggested something was happening to people who visited the Gemini, though agents still didn't have direct evidence of what was occurring inside. Internal mob tensions. Roy's success and his crew's high body count had made him simultaneously valuable and dangerous to the Gambino family leadership. On one hand, Roy was an excellent earner, generated significant income through his car theft operation and through murder contracts, and was willing to handle the violent work that needed to be done. On the other hand, Roy's operation was attracting law enforcement attention. Roy's methods were considered excessively brutal, even by mob standards, and there was concern that Roy had killed so many people that eventually someone would talk or evidence would emerge that would expose not just Roy, but the entire Gambino family to prosecution. By 1982, Gambino boss Paul Castellano had decided that Roy needed to be eliminated. The decision wasn't made lightly. Roy was still generating income, was still useful, but Castellano believed that the law enforcement pressure on Roy would eventually extend to the entire family, that Roy's arrest would lead to investigations of everyone associated with him, and that sacrificing Roy was necessary to protect the larger organization. Castellano's plan was to order Roy's murder through Anthony Gaggi, Roy's immediate superior in the family hierarchy. Gaggi was instructed to arrange Roy's death in a way that would look like something other than a mob hit, that would prevent it from appearing that the Gambino family had turned on one of its own. Roy's paranoia. Roy, who'd survived as long as he had by being careful and suspicious, sensed that something was wrong by late 1982. He noticed that Gaggy was avoiding him, that meetings were being canceled, that he was being excluded from family business that he'd normally be involved in. Roy understood mob politics well enough to know what these signs meant. He was being isolated, was being distanced from family operations, was being set up for elimination. Roy responded by going into partial hiding, varying his routines, avoiding the Gemini Lounge where he was most vulnerable, staying at various safe houses and with different family members rather than at his own home where he could be easily found. He also began making arrangements to flee, had cash hidden, had false identification prepared, had contacts in other states who could potentially help him disappear if he needed to run. But Roy also made a critical error. He began reaching out to crew members, trying to determine their loyalty, trying to assess whether they'd stand with him if he decided to break from the Gambino family and operate independently. These conversations were mistakes because they gave crew members reason to believe Roy was planning something that would expose them all to danger, that Roy's paranoia might lead to actions that would bring down law enforcement on everyone. The final murder, Roy DeMeo. On January 10th, 1983, the same day that the dismembered torso was found in Sheepshead Bay, that would eventually be traced to the crew, Roy DeMeo was found dead in the trunk of his own car, parked near a Patty Duke's restaurant in Brooklyn. He'd been shot multiple times in the head, execution style, his body left in a position that made clear this was a mob hit rather than a robbery or random violence. The exact circumstances of Roy's death remain unclear because the people who killed him, likely some combination of his own crew members and other Gambino family soldiers, have never provided complete accounts, and because multiple versions of the story exist. But the most credible reconstruction suggests that Roy was lured to a meeting under false pretenses, was shot by people he trusted, and his body was left in his car as a message to others in the organization about what happened to people who became liabilities. Roy's death occurred approximately 6 weeks after Paul Castellano had ordered his elimination, suggesting that finding an opportunity to kill Roy while he was in hiding had taken time, that Roy's paranoia and security precautions had delayed his murder but hadn't prevented it. With Roy dead, the crew immediately began to fragment. Some members tried to continue operating independently, but without Roy's leadership and without the protection of the Gambino family, they were vulnerable. Law enforcement pressure intensified as FBI agents, now working with information that suggested Roy's crew had been responsible for numerous murders, began aggressive investigation of surviving crew members. The investigation of the DeMeo crew's murders was one of the most complex and lengthy organized crime investigations in FBI history, spanning from 1983 through the late 1980s and involving cooperation between federal agents, NYPD detectives, and prosecutors from multiple jurisdictions. The challenge: investigators faced enormous obstacles in building prosecutable cases. First, most victims couldn't be identified because their remains had been dismembered and scattered, because identifying features like faces and fingerprints had been removed, and because the crew had been careful to avoid leaving forensic evidence that could connect remains to specific individuals. Second, even when victims could be identified, connecting their murders to the DeMeo crew required either physical evidence or testimony from crew members themselves, both of which were difficult to obtain. Physical evidence was scarce because the crew's methods had been designed specifically to eliminate forensic traces. Testimony required convincing crew members to cooperate, to admit their own involvement in multiple murders in exchange for plea deals that would reduce their sentences. Third, the crew's loyalty to each other and their understanding that cooperation with authorities meant implicating themselves in dozens of murders created powerful disincentives to cooperation. Why would someone admit to participating in 50+ murders when staying silent meant prosecutors couldn't prove they'd participated in any specific murder? The breakthrough, Dominic Montilio. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Dominic Montilio, nephew of Anthony Gaggi, Roy's superior in the Gambino family, who'd been around the crew for years and who'd witnessed some of their activities, though he'd never been a core member. Montilio had his own legal problems. He'd been arrested on unrelated charges, and he made the calculation that cooperating with authorities about the DeMeo crew's activities might be his best option for avoiding life in prison. Montilio's testimony, provided to FBI agents in 1983 and 1984, was the first comprehensive insider account of the crew's operations. He described the Gemini Method in detail, identified crew members, provided information about specific murders, and explained how the crew had operated for nearly a decade. His testimony wasn't sufficient by itself to prosecute most crew members. Prosecutors needed corroboration, needed physical evidence or additional witnesses, but it provided a roadmap for investigation, told agents where to look for evidence and who to target for additional cooperation. The dominoes fall. Montilio's cooperation created pressure on other crew members. Once one person had talked, once prosecutors had insider testimony describing the crew's operations, other members faced decision points: stay loyal and risk being prosecuted based on Montilio's testimony, or cooperate themselves and potentially receive better deals in exchange for providing additional information. Over the next several years, multiple crew members made deals with prosecutors. Henry Borelli, facing murder charges, cooperated and provided testimony about specific murders he'd participated in. Joseph Testa and Anthony Center, the Gemini twins, were convicted of multiple murders based on testimony from other crew members and forensic evidence from some of the few victims whose remains had been found. Vito Arena, a peripheral member, cooperated and described the crew's disposal methods and locations. Not all crew members cooperated. Some, like Chris Rosenberg, were already dead by the time prosecutions began. Others maintained silence, accepted long prison sentences rather than cooperating with authorities, remained loyal to mob codes about not becoming informants, even when that loyalty meant spending the rest of their lives in prison. The prosecutions. The prosecutions of DeMeo crew members stretched through the late 1980s and into the 1990s. The cases were complicated by several factors. First, the time that had elapsed between many of the murders and the prosecutions meant witnesses' memories had degraded, evidence had been lost or destroyed, and some potential witnesses had died. Second, the crew members' cooperation deals created defense attorneys' arguments that cooperating witnesses were unreliable, that they were testifying in exchange for reduced sentences and therefore had incentives to exaggerate or fabricate to satisfy prosecutors. Third, the sheer number of murders made it difficult to try all cases. Prosecutors had to select specific murders where evidence was strongest and where they had the best chances of conviction, meaning most of the crew's murders were never prosecuted simply because building cases for all 75+ murders would have been impractical. The most significant convictions were Anthony Center and Joseph Testa were convicted of multiple murders and racketeering charges in 1989, received life sentences without possibility of parole. Anthony Gaggi, Roy's superior, was convicted of racketeering and murder conspiracy in 1988, died in prison in 1988 before he could be sentenced. Several peripheral crew members received sentences ranging from 15 years to life. Depending on their level of involvement and whether they cooperated, these convictions represented only a fraction of the crew's actual crimes. Probably 25 of the 200 murders were ever prosecuted, and even fewer resulted in convictions. The rest remained officially unsolved, were missing persons cases that were never closed, were families that never received confirmation about what had happened to their loved ones. The families of the DeMeo crew's victims faced unique challenges that extended beyond the normal trauma of losing loved ones to murder. The systematic destruction of evidence, the disappearance of bodies, the years or decades of uncertainty about what had happened created a form of psychological trauma called ambiguous loss, grief without closure, mourning without confirmation, hope and despair existing simultaneously. The Katz family. Andrei Katz's parents, Russian émigrés who'd come to America in the 1970s seeking better opportunities for their family, filed a missing persons report in 1975 when Andrei failed to return home from what he'd said was a business meeting. Police told them that Andrei was probably avoiding arrest on pending drug charges, that he'd likely fled to another state or country, that missing persons cases involving adults with criminal records rarely ended with the person being found because they'd typically left voluntarily. The Katz family maintained hope that Andrei was alive for over a decade, until 1986, when FBI agents informed them that Andrei had been murdered by the DeMeo crew in 1975, that his body had been dismembered and disposed of, that his remains would probably never be found. The confirmation of death, while painful, was also relief, finally knowing, finally being able to stop hoping, finally being able to grieve properly rather than existing in the liminal space between hope and despair. But even confirmation didn't provide complete closure because there was no body to bury, no grave to visit, no physical place where the family could direct their grief. Andrei's mother told investigators that the lack of burial place was like having her son die over and over. She'd visit the cemetery where other family members were buried, would imagine where Andrei should be, would experience the loss anew each time she confronted the empty space where his grave should have been. The Rothenberg family. Paul Rothenberg's family experienced similar trauma, complicated by the fact that Paul had been involved in criminal activity, which created conflicting emotions: grief for a lost son, anger at his choices, guilt about feeling angry at someone who'd been murdered. Paul's mother told a journalist years later that the hardest,